So how do you get people who are living in Nazareth over to Bethlehem to have a baby? Well, God places on the heart of Caesar Augustus that at that particular time they're going to have a census, and that meant everybody go back to their hometown. So that meant that Joseph and Mary had to pick up and go back over to Bethlehem. Now, isn't it interesting that they go over there about the same time as to have the baby? And whenever they get to Bethlehem, she is with child, and it's time for the baby, and the baby is born in Bethlehem. How? Just like God said it would be done. Just like God said it would be accomplished. So two things as far as logic. The fact of how he was born and where he was born. Today I want you to see that God also foretold that he would protect his Messiah. That he would protect his Messiah. There would be a reason he would have to protect him, but he would protect him. And he shows how that happens. It's actually two prophecies that are intertwined together. One of the prophecies is in Hosea 11:1. In Hosea 11:1, where in that prophecy he foretells that the Messiah is actually going to come out of Egypt. Now think about that. Joseph and Mary reside in Nazareth. They go to Bethlehem for the baby to be born, but the Messiah is going to have to come out of Egypt. Hosea foretells that in 11:1 that the Messiah is actually going to be called out of Egypt. Well, how does that happen, and why does that happen? Then you find that in Jeremiah's prophecy, Jeremiah foretells something else. He tells about a horrible experience where there's a cry in this town of Bethlehem or the surrounding area of Ramah. It's going to be this cry because a horrible event has happened and children have been killed. Children have been killed. Now let me tell you something. The other day I studied this passage, and we were going over the passage and getting prepared. And then the event that happened on Friday, that was Friday, wasn't it? Yes. On Friday, the event that happened up in Connecticut, and those things so paralleled each other, it was almost an eerie thing, because when you find the source of the event back in Jesus' day as well as the source of the event of our day, you're going to find out it has the same source. The same source. But those two prophecies together, Jeremiah and Hosea. Hosea wrote his prophecy in 739 BC. He actually, from 739 to 715, he wrote about it. Now, Hosea talked about a lot of things. He talked about the covenant that God had with his people, and he talked about the fact that whenever they didn't keep the covenant, that the curses that would come upon the nation of Israel were happening. But he also said that there's going to be a restoration. There's going to be a restoring time, a restoration when God would call his people back. Jeremiah, whenever he gives his prophecy, he actually lived in 627 to 582 BC. He's a little bit younger than the other prophets that we have seen, a little bit later than them. Jeremiah also talks about the impending judgment that the children of Israel are going to experience, but he likewise talks about the fact that there's going to come this Messiah and a new day and a new covenant when God would write his law on the tablets of men's heart instead of on tablets of stone. And these prophets, Hosea and Jeremiah, their two prophecies come together and intertwine into a story about how God protects his Messiah. Listen to what it says in Matthew 2, verse 13 and following. Now remember what's happened to this point. The Magi have come. They've asked Herod, where is the Messiah to be born? The Sanhedrin told them it was going to be in Bethlehem, and the Magi go to Bethlehem, find baby Jesus, worship him, and instead of going back to tell Herod like he wanted them to do, they'd been warned by God not to go back, so they went home another way. That's what happens in 13. Now when they had departed, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, Arise and take the child and his mother and flee to Egypt and remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. And he arose and took the child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt, and was there until the death of Herod, that what was spoken by the Lord through the prophet might be fulfilled, saying, Out of Egypt, you did underline that, out of Egypt did I call my son. That's a quote from Hosea 11:1. Verse 16. Then when Herod saw that he had been tricked by the Magi, he became very enraged and sent and slew all the male children who were in Bethlehem and in all its environs from 2 years old and under, according to the time when he had ascertained from the Magi. Then that which was spoken through Jeremiah the prophet was fulfilled, saying, this is found in Jeremiah 31:15. Here's what Jeremiah wrote. A voice was heard in Ramah, weeping and great mourning, Rachel weeping for her children, and she refused to be comforted because they were no more. What happened? Well, the Magi, being warned by God, went home a different way. And whenever they went home a different way, Herod found out about it, and Herod was enraged. He was angry because Herod was wanting not to come and worship the Messiah, not to come and worship the King of the Jews. He had one purpose in mind. He wanted to find out where he was so that he could destroy him, that he might be able to destroy him. That's why God sent the Magi back a different way. Let's talk about Herod for a minute. Herod, the king of the Jews. Well, he really wasn't the king of the Jews. He was a Dumian by birth, by origin, which means that he was not a true Jew. He was not born Jewish. The only way that he was considered a Jew is the fact that he practiced the Jewish faith. And so he began to practice the Jewish faith, but he was not a Jew by birth. He was one who believed the Word of God, the Old Testament being the Word of God, but he was a paradox. He's not the only one we've ever seen this way. He believed that the Word of God was true, but he did not live by it. He did not live by it. He did not follow it. He did not let that be the creed of his life or the direction of his life. Matter of fact, Herod was a wicked, wicked king, a wicked man. Matter of fact, his crimes were infamous in that time. He would kill people just at the drop of a hat. Matter of fact, he killed his own children. If he ever thought that any of his children might be trying to take over his throne, he would have them killed. He killed a number of his wives because he thought that they might be plotting against him somehow to take over his throne. He killed his wives, he killed his children. It didn't matter to him who he killed. Augustus Caesar, it said, made this comment about Herod. He said, it's better to be Herod's sow than his son. For Herod's sow would have a better chance of living in a Jewish culture than his sons. Think about that. Better to be a sow than his sons. That's how ruthless he was. That's how mean-spirited he was. Matter of fact, right before he died, he called all the noblemen in, and he visited with them and talked with them. And then whenever they all left, identifying those noblemen, he gave this instruction that on the day he died, every one of those noblemen were to be killed, so that there would be universal grieving when he died. He knew nobody's going to grieve over him dying, so he wanted to kill a bunch of people so that in that nation there'd be universal grieving whenever he died. Herod was so anxious because he knew he didn't have the right to be king that he was constantly trying to fight against anybody who was going to be king or recognized to be king. So when the Magi come and they say, we've seen his star, where is the King of the Jews? Boy, did that ever prick his thoughts in his mind and ever get him ready to do something about it. And when he found out it was in Bethlehem and the Magi were supposed to go worship and come and tell him back, when he found out that it was in Bethlehem, he was going to go and destroy that Messiah. He was going to go destroy the King of the Jews. He wasn't going to have anybody competing for that position that he held, that he honored, that he wanted. Well, the only problem was that whenever the Magi found out by God they weren't supposed to go back, he became enraged. Notice what it says. He was enraged that they did not come back and tell him. So what did he do? He set out a decree, and here was the decree, that all the male children from 2 years of age and under were to be killed in Bethlehem and Bethlehem's environs or territories. That every male child 2 years of age and under. Now, based on the time he got from the Magi. Now, that's going to mess up your Christmas story a little bit probably, because the Magi probably didn't get there the same night that the shepherds did. Matter of fact, more than likely, it doesn't say Jesus was still in the stable, but Jesus and Mary, they found him in a home. And based on that age, Jesus could have been as old as 2 years of age. That's possible because, he could have lived there. Joseph could have chosen to stay there. His trade would allow him to do that. He could have been as old as 2. Or he was to a certain age because it said they had seen the star 2 years before that time. And he could have expanded that a little bit. Said, I want to make sure anybody who might be the Messiah is killed. So he says, every male child in Bethlehem and its territory is to be killed on one night. He sends his soldiers into the town of Bethlehem, and they destroy all the male children 2 years of age and under. That is not a surprise because it had been foretold that was going to happen. That's what Jeremiah was talking about. There in verse 18 it says Jeremiah had spoken about this. He says, a voice was heard in Ramah. Where is Ramah, or what is it? Ramah was one of the boundaries of Bethlehem's territory. It wasn't just the town of Bethlehem, it was the whole territory. And Ramah was identified as one of those boundaries. In other words, you will kill the people, the children, up to Ramah, but beyond that you let them live. And Ramah was one of the boundary territories, so he's saying it's not only Bethlehem, but it's the territory of Bethlehem, that inside of that there's going to be the putting to death of these male children 2 years of age and under. He goes on and says, weeping and great mourning. Notice what it says, Rachel weeping for her children. Rachel weeping for her children. Now Rachel was considered by most Jews as being the mother of Israel. Isn't it interesting? It's really not Sarah. Rachel was considered more the mother of Israel than Sarah was. And the interesting thing about Rachel, who was considered the mother of the Jews, her burial place was right outside the city of Bethlehem, in that territory. And what Jeremiah is foretelling, what Jeremiah is saying regarding the Messiah, is that there's going to be an occasion where the mother of Israel is going to weep over her people as she is there in Bethlehem, residing there in Bethlehem. There's going to be an occasion to weep. Weeping and mourning and the great cry that rises up out of the territory of Bethlehem. And she refused to be comforted because they were no more. Her children had been killed. Those babies had been killed. Now, in Jeremiah's prophecy, he's talking about the time of Babylonian captivity, first of all, but the second application of that is a messianic application, that when the Messiah comes, there's going to be a horrible event that's going to happen in the Bethlehem territory whenever Israel is going to be weeping and Rachel is going to weep for her children, for they are no more. A horrible event is going to happen. An interesting thing, Josephus, who's a secular historian, the Jewish secular historian, he doesn't record this event in his history. And somebody might wonder why. One of the reasons why is, first of all, Bethlehem was a very small territory. It's a very small town. I told you that. Estimate it could be as few as 20 children. Isn't that interesting? 20 children, as few as 20 children to be killed actually through this event. And it was so common for Herod to go and destroy people and to wipe out sects of people that Josephus, almost as a secular historian, didn't even consider that significant because it happened all the time. But for the people of Bethlehem, it was significant. For those mothers who had those babies ripped out of their hands and taken and killed by soldiers, it was significant. For the people of that time, it was special. And God foretold that this event was going to happen. That this event was going to take place. Wow. Why? Well, Herod's wicked. But there's another reason. There's a far deeper reason that you and I need to understand why this happens. It wasn't just Herod. It was that Herod was a pawn for somebody else. Do you know that somebody else who has overseen all the wickedness in this world? That's Satan. Satan is the power. Satan is the one who planned this. Satan is the one who wants to destroy the Messiah. Satan is the destroyer of all people. And I'm here to tell you, just as Satan was instrumental in this, what happened on Friday is Satan as well. And you got to understand that's the result of sin. That's the result of Satan's dominion. It's the result of evil. And when people want to turn back and they want to say, where is God and why didn't God do this? You got to remember it goes all the way back to when we turned over authority to Satan and the God of this world and wickedness. And until that day of redemption, when the consummation of time, when God makes all things right, we still have to deal with the suffering of sin. And Satan is behind it all. The shameful thing to me is that people want to blame God and Satan gets off scot-free. You know that? And Satan is the cause of it. And Satan was the cause of this. Do you know why Satan was behind this? Let me explain to you. Let's walk through history for a minute. As soon as Adam and Eve fell, God came and He spoke to Adam and Eve, but He also spoke to Satan. You remember that? And this is what He told that old serpent. He says, you are going to bruise man's heel, but there's going to be one who comes of man that's going to crush your head. Out of the seed of man, there's going to be one who's going to crush your head. And from that time on, Satan began to look and try to find who it was going to be that was going to crush his head. First of all, he wants to try to destroy mankind. Why do you think Cain killed Abel? Cain killed Abel because Satan said, if through man I'm going to be crushed, I'm going to try to destroy man. I'm going to try to destroy man, so get Cain to kill Abel. Well, that didn't work. So what happened next? He caused sin to be so great in the world that it stunk in the nostrils of God, and God was ready to destroy His world, and He did destroy the world, save 7 people, Noah. But whenever those people survived, there was still that seed that was going to crush. That was going to crush Satan's head. As you continue on, he comes to find out that it's not just going to be out of the seed of man, but God specifically identifies where it's going to come from. That it's going to be through the Jews, that out of that Jewish people, there's going to rise one. In Numbers 24:17, it says there's going to rise one, a star is going to rise up out of Jacob, and a scepter will be in his hand, and he will destroy you. You know what God just did? God just told Satan that it's not going to be just the people, it's going to be out of the Jews, whereby you're going to be destroyed. Wow. So what does he begin then? He begins to try to destroy the Jews. In the midst of that, hold on a second. Whenever the children of Israel went into Egypt, isn't it interesting, when they went into Egypt, they began to populate so much that what finally happened? Pharaoh gave a command that all the what? Male children would be killed, thrown into the Nile River. Now I wonder why he came up with that plan. Because it's through that male child that's going to be that king, that's going to be that Messiah of the Jews, whereby Satan's head is going to be crushed. Not only that, do you remember the story of Esther, one of my favorite stories in the Bible? You remember in the story of Esther where Haman, who's the wicked man, that he decides that he convinces King Ahasuerus that they need to destroy all the what? The Jews. Need to destroy all the Jews. For he knew, Satan, working through Haman and Ahasuerus, if I can destroy all the Jews, then there'll be no one who'll be the Messiah who can crush my head. And the persecution of the Jews that happened all in that time was Satan working through those instruments whereby, listen, whereby he could keep that one who's going to have the scepter in his hand from being in control. But he never can do it. Why? Because God always wins. He always wins. And the baby has now been born. Baby Jesus has been born. The Messiah has been born. Herod finds out about it, but more importantly, Satan finds out about it. That baby has been born. So what's the next thing? The next logical thing is, since he's been born, we need to destroy him before he grows up and can crush my head. So send that army and destroy the babies, the boys of Bethlehem. And he thinks he can win. But bless God, there's another prophet who had something else to say. Jeremiah tells us there's going to be this day of mourning. There's going to be this time of massacre. There's going to be the destruction of these children where Rachel is weeping over her children. That is going to happen, but Hosea tells us something else. He tells us that God is always a step ahead. One of the great things about God, the God we worship, is that God already knows what's going to happen ahead of time. Nothing sneaks up on God. It may sneak up on you. But if you'll have a relationship with a living God who already knows what's going to happen, you know what? That God may tell you what you need to do. He may direct you where you need to go. He does that. At least that's what we find out in this passage of Scripture. Go back to verse 13. What did it say there in verse 13? It says this. Now when they had departed, talking about the Magi, behold, an angel of the Lord appeared to Joseph in a dream, saying, what did he say? Arise and take the child and his mother and flee to some country. Is that what your translation says? What does your translation say? And flee to Egypt. And you shall remain there until I tell you, for Herod is going to search for the child to destroy him. Do you hear that? God comes, He wakes up Joseph, and He tells Joseph, this is what I need you to do. I need you to do it right now. This is where you're going to go, and this is how long you're going to stay there. And He not only does that, He tells him why. Because Herod is going to come and try to destroy that son. He's going to try to destroy that son. Now, here's the neat thing about it. God knows. He knows more than Satan. He knows more than Herod. He's always a step ahead. And He goes and He begins that process. He speaks that word. Now, Joseph sometimes is not, in the Christmas story, it's kind of pushed aside because he's not the real father. Let me tell you something. Joseph is a tremendous example. Men, you need to take Joseph as a tremendous example of what it means to be a father. It means to be a husband. Okay? Now think about this. God could have chosen anybody to be the husband and the father, right? But He chose Joseph. And the reason He chose Joseph is for a number of reasons. One is this. He knew that He would be able to talk to Joseph, and Joseph would listen to Him. The way that He spoke to Joseph was through a dream. That's the way God communicated in that time. Now it's not usually through dreams. It can be, I guess. But now we have the Holy Spirit of God who speaks directly to our heart. But at that time, he had a dream, and God spoke to Joseph through a dream. And in that dream, this is what God told him. I need you to get up right now. I need you to get that child and the mother, and I need you to flee. Take them over to Egypt. You got to do that because Herod is going to destroy this baby, going to destroy this son. And Joseph, listen, Joseph was a man who listened to God. He had a walk with God. And in that walk with God, when God told him what to do, here's the simple thing, guys, and this is the most important thing for you as a father, for a husband to know. He was obedient to God. You'll be a great father, a great husband if you'll be obedient to God. Now here's obedience. Let me tell you what obedience is. Obedience to God means you do what God tells you to do. Listen, when He tells you to do it. I don't know if you get the whole of this story. Verse 14, and he arose and took the child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt. You catch the whole of that story? God says, get up now immediately, take this baby and the mother and go to Egypt immediately. You've got to do that. And he said, yes, Lord, I will. And he did it when God told him to do it. Now, hold on, guys. Just let me tell you something. This will help you a lot. It's not just obedience to do what God tells you to do. It's to do what God tells you to do when He tells you to do it. Sometimes we get messed up because we think we're going to do what God tells us to do, but I'm going to wait. What if Joseph would have said, well, God, I'll do that, but I think I'll wait a week or so. God, I think I'll do that, but I got to close up shop. God, I think I'll do that. I'll wait for the weather to change. God, I think I'll do that, but I'll wait. If he would have waited, what would have happened to the Messiah? What would have taken place? Herod would have shown up. So he didn't only just do what God told him to do, he did what God told him to do when God told him to do it. And he woke his family up. He gets her on a donkey, and they're making their way to Egypt. Now, not only is Joseph a great example of what it means to be a husband and a father, but women, hold on a second. Mary's a great example of what it means to be a wife and a mother. Read that. Don't depersonalize this passage. Sometimes we read the Bible like a manual instead of what it is. It's a story. Listen to what it says. Underline this, ladies. And he arose and took the child and his mother by night and departed for Egypt. Did y'all get that, ladies? Husband wakes you up middle of the night. Hey, you got to get up. You got to get up. You got to get ready. You got to get the baby ready. And we got to get you on a donkey. Not a Learjet. Not a car. We got to get you on a donkey, and we got to go to Egypt. And Mary does it. She's submissive. What if Mary had been like some women? You crazy. I'm not going, not tonight. Maybe tomorrow. Do you know what I've been through? You know how long it takes me to pack? You ever ridden on a donkey? She was submissive to her husband. He heard God, and she followed his direction. And to be submissive means that you follow the direction of that man that's supposed to be obedient to God. And whenever he is obedient, and he's the father that needs to be, and Mary gets on that donkey, and they go to Egypt, it says, and was there until the death of Herod, that was spoken of by the Lord through the prophets, that it might be fulfilled. Hold on a second. How long were they there? Till Herod dies. Till the danger is gone. Till God says, come home. And when Herod dies, God says, it's time to come home. Listen, in verse 15, Hosea had prophesied about it. He says, and therefore out of Egypt did I call my son. How could that just happen? That could not be chance. That could not be circumstance. That could not be an accident. It was God who knows what's going to happen before it happened, foretelling how Jesus is born, where he's going to be born, that he's going to have to be preserved by going to Egypt, and in a given time, he's going to be called out of Egypt. And the reason that he went to Egypt, because there's going to be weeping over in Bethlehem, because babies are going to be killed by a ruthless king and Satan. And I am protecting my child. There's no possible way, just those 4 events that we've talked about, those 4 events could happen, been prophesied 800 years before it takes place. And imagine all of those characters that have to play those parts. You're going to get Herod to play a part? You're going to get Herod to go kill some when he not planned to do it? How does that happen? Because God already knows what's going to happen. Out of Egypt I will call my son. You know, an interesting thing about that, a parallel that happens in that story. Do you remember that God, the first time that he needed to preserve his people, Israel? You remember there was a famine, a great famine that was happening in their land. And the way he was going to preserve his nation of Israel, he sent them to what country? Sent them to Egypt. And who was the guy who made the way? Who's the guy who made the way for them? What was his name? His name was Joseph. His name was Joseph. Isn't that interesting? So that in a given time that his people would come out of Egypt and would go to live in the promised land and fulfill that goal, accomplish that purpose. What about the parallel with Jesus? in order for God to protect His Son, His Messiah, He gets him to the land of Egypt. And who took him there? A man named, what was that name? A man named Joseph. In order that in due time he would come back out of the land of Egypt and fulfill the purpose of the Messiah. And God tells us it's all going to happen before it happens. Now, I'm just here to tell you, if I were not a believer, if I were not a Christian, and I sat and I saw just those four things that happened in history, foretold and accomplished, and all those things, it would have to make me begin to see and sense there's something to this other than just accident. There's something to this other than just some plan or some hoax. The only way this could actually happen is God must really be in charge, and He really is in charge. And if He's in charge, you need to understand this, that not only does the prophecy talk about the fact of what Jesus would do, tells us where Jesus died and why He died, and it also tells us about the end time and what's going to happen to us eventually. And you need to believe that God, because He already knows. And if you don't have a saving relationship and you have never put your trust in Jesus, you need to do that today. Not tomorrow, today. I think I'll wait. What if Joseph had waited? Today might be the day that you have that opportunity to respond, that God calls on you. If you've never given your heart to Jesus, you need to do that. And what about you, child of God? There's a word for you. To know that you can trust in that God. I'm glad I serve a God like we serve. I'm glad things don't sneak up on Him. I'm glad He has a plan that laid out through all eternity. I'm glad I can trust in Him. When I can't see, I know that I can trust in Him. And I'm glad He's a God who speaks to me just like He spoke to Joseph. And I'm glad He tells me what to do, that I can be obedient to that. I'm glad I serve a God like that. And if you serve a God like that, you ought to be thanking God for that. You ought to be rejoicing that God is such a God that you get to have a relationship with Him.